Now let's talk about what for some people is a very big intimidating concept, and that is color management. This is a part of color grading that many people kind of skip or shy away from, but if we can start with a really good color management foundation, it just makes everything so much easier. So what is color management? I think the easiest way to kind of think about this is with the analogy of developing film. So back before digital, still cameras as well as movie cameras would shoot on film. And unless you had your own darkroom of some kind, you would have to take your film to a store to be developed. And you couldn't see what kind of pictures you were taking. You couldn't look at your images before they were developed. And it was only after the film was developed that you can actually look at the images your camera captured. Now, luckily, we aren't in that state anymore. But this is a really good analogy for how we need to kind of respect our images. Pretty much all professional video cameras nowadays shoot with what's called log encoding. That's short for logarithmic. And there's a bunch of fancy math that has to do with logarithmic functions and how different brightnesses are transformed and all this stuff that is a little bit intense if you're not a super nerd. But what it really means is this. When you take an image of something that exists in the real world, there are a range of colors and a range of brightnesses that exist. Everything from really bright, like looking directly at the sun, all the way down to just about black in the darkest shadows. And our eyes are really good at adapting to whatever brightness we throw at it. That's why at night, if there's a full moon out, you can actually see pretty well. And if it's a bright, bright sunny day, you can still see well. If you were to expose your camera for bright sunlight and then don't change any of the settings, and you try and shoot at night or in a dark house, everything is going to be way, way, way too dark to the point where you can't even see what's going on. And that's because the difference between the brightest parts and the darkest parts in real life is way bigger than what a camera can see. This difference between the bright and darkest parts is called dynamic range. So, as cameras have gotten better, they've gotten better at capturing more of this dynamic range. If you've heard of HDR images, those are designed to capture really bright and really dark at the same time. But even then, the video files that we're recording, they just can't really hold all this information. So in order to get as much information as we possibly can with the equipment that we have, cameras shoot in log. And like I said, there's a bunch of fancy math here, but really what it's doing is it's darkening the brightest parts and it's brightening the darkest parts so that you can get as much dynamic range possible in your image. So something that's like 10 brightness might be brought down to 5 brightness. Something that is 10% dark might be brought up to 30% dark. You can think of this like when you're all done camping and you're packing up your tent and you take the tent poles out and everything, and then you squish it all down into a stuff sack of some kind. That great big tent kind of gets folded down into a little tiny space. And that's really what our cameras are doing with the colors and brightnesses that they see in the real world. It's kind of folding them and pushing them into this little space that it can actually think about. And when it does this, the byproduct of it is that we get this kind of gray washed out image, which if you look in our project here, if we turn off my color grades here, that's what we have, this really gray washed out, ugly looking image. And this is all about getting the most detail in the brightest parts of the image and the darkest parts of the image, as well as kind of taming back the brighter colors. For instance, this pink was really, really bright on set, but it doesn't look very bright here in our log image. Everything looks gray and washed out and ugly. So then that presents a problem when it comes to color correction. How do we get this ugly gray log footage to look natural again? Because we don't want it to look ugly and gray. We want to have as much of the information as we can from our original image and also have it look natural. But how do we get there? Well, basically there are two major ways to turn a log image into something that looks natural. The first way is to do color by eye. This is essentially looking at the log image and saying, okay, these highlights need to be brighter and brightening them up. These shadows need to be darker and darkening them down. Whatever colors are in the image need to be more intense and then upping the saturation. And so we kind of dial this in by eye, which does work, and it gives us a nice looking image, But one problem is it's really up to whoever is running the color grade, and it's really dependent on what kind of monitor they're using, whether it's calibrated, and all of the things that we talked about in our chapter about color setup. And it also has to do with personal taste. And there's all these other factors that go into this image, and the final image may or may not be accurate to what this actually looked like in real life. Now, is that a huge deal? Not always. But what happens when we do it this way is that we're not really beginning with the cleanest starting point. We're not working to make better an untouched image. We're actually kind of messing with it first. And it's really dependent on personal taste and kind of what looks good in the moment. That's why we call this color by eye. And the fancy term for this is display referred, which means that it's referring to what your display looks like and kind of how this image looks. Again, for a practical sense, is anyone really going to know that it didn't really look like this? Probably not. But we're not truly giving ourselves the best shot to make the best image. So what's a different way we can go about this? This is where color management comes in. The job of color management is to take this log image and identify what camera it's from, and take into account how the camera records this log signal and unfold it to be as accurate as possible to what was actually there on set. We call this scene referred because we're actually referring to the scene that we shot and the way it was shot, what camera was used to shoot it. This way, we're giving ourselves an objective starting point, and we're not making any creative decisions before we see what was actually captured by the camera. Again, this is kind of like developing your film. When you run something through color management, that's the first time you're seeing what the camera actually saw and not just this kind of log image that's sort of the image at an intermediate state. So a simplified explanation of kind of how this works is, imagine you had a graph of the brightnesses in an image, and it ranged from the darkest part all the way to the lightest part. This is how it looks in real life. And then a log image messes with that graph a little bit. So the things that are really bright might be brought down to not quite as bright. The things that are midtones might be a little brighter. And basically every point along this line is adjusted in a way that will maximize the dynamic range that's recorded. So this little curve, that makes a log image. And what we can do is use something called a color transform that is pretty much this exact curve, but inverted. And when you add this curve to this curve, it kind of reverses things and you end up with an image that looks more natural. You could think of it sort of like this. I'm going to hide a few things on our interface here, but our custom curves here is kind of a similar graph. And if the camera does something like this to the image, where the darkest parts are kind of lifted up like this, and the brightest parts aren't quite as bright, and this curve kind of flattens out as it gets brighter. If we take this curve and kind of do the opposite, we end up with a more natural looking image. And that's basically what a color transform does, is it adds the opposite of whatever curve the camera uses to record images. But if we're just going to reverse this, then why go through all of this anyway? Why don't we just not deal with any of that and not record in log? The reason is so that we can do all of our major color work on our log image that has a bunch of information packed into it and use as much information to do our color work. And then we kind of adapt that to whatever display we want it to look good on. This gives us a lot of wiggle room to be able to do all kinds of fancy color things while keeping the detail in the highlights or the shadows, making sure colors aren't too bright or we don't lose any information. If you've never really worked with color management before, this can be a lot to kind of wrap your head around. But for now, if you can remember this, we record images in log so that we can pack as much information into a compressed file format as we can. Then we can make our color adjustments and then reverse that log curve so that things look nice on our display. And that whole workflow is called color management.